Beyond the edge of reality lies a story of ultimate conquest, a story of a love that can never be, and a hatred that always was.
In 1997, Square released what to this day is still considered one of the greatest games of all time, that took JRPGs outside of Japan, brought the franchise to Europe, and cemented the PlayStation's place in the 5th generation of consoles. And it's also responsible for my third favourite export from Italy. I've been researching the history of this iconic game's development since June 2022, and after reading Matt Leone's amazing book 500 Years Later, An Oral History of Final Fantasy VII, I really want to share this story. Full disclosure, I'm gonna pull from Matt's work a lot, but I haven't pulled a Summerton and just yanked it without checking. Matt's a total legend, and you should check out the book and his article on Polygon, because he's that guy. But without further ado, this is the history of Final Fantasy VII. To really understand Final Fantasy VII, we have to understand the history of its creators. Squaresoft ironically began life as a subsidiary to power conglomerate Denusha before going independent in 1986. This earlier Square operated in a far more loose manner than its modern incarnation, and didn't even have the Enix at the end of its name, being described less like a business and more like a place for creatives to hang out and create. We just wanted to do what we like. We weren't worried about salaries or living situations, or thinking, where is the company going? One such person was Hironobu Sakaguchi, a creator who'd been with Square since he deferred from college to pursue a career in gaming. But he'd grown tired of working on action games like King's Knight and resolved to let his next game decide whether he'd stay with Square or return to his education. With that in mind, his final game would be something he wanted to play, inspired by the scale of The Legend of Zelda, but sharing the same genre as the Ultima series, and all in an attempt to surpass Enix's Dragon Quest. The end result was the very first Final Fantasy. From its initial release, the series exploded and completely established Square as an RPG powerhouse, and gained Sakaguchi a reputation as Square's executive wunderkind. He would go on to direct the next 4 Final Fantasy entries between 1988 to 1992, and was even promoted to executive vice president of Squaresoft in 1991. However, it wasn't all successes for Sakaguchi. When we were creating Final Fantasy III, my mother passed away, and ever since, I've been thinking about the theme of life. These themes of life, death, and grief would stay with Sakaguchi till Square finally decided to make it the basis for Final Fantasy VII, in which 3 separate attempts were made to create it. The first began life as another Super Famicom game, or Super Nintendo if you speak American. Production started with a small team immediately after Final Fantasy VI wrapped. This was less a real dedicated effort, and more like when you try to talk to a cute girl and you trip over your shoelaces and hit the ground so hard a testicle shoots back up into your body. Yeah, you tried, but it's still not something you're gonna talk about a lot. This half-life was due to the ballooning scale of Sakaguchi's passion project Chrono Trigger, which absorbed the initial Final Fantasy VII team, along with several others at Square, to complete its development. And if you've ever played Chrono Trigger, totally worth it. That game is incredible. With development of that game completed, more resources could be dedicated to Final Fantasy VII, including a story outlined by Sakaguchi himself, as well as introducing the Mako reactors and the eco-terrorist group Avalanche. However, this would still be a far cry from the final game, as it focused on a detective named Joe in New York City chasing these eco-terrorists. While the NYC setting in Detective Joe would later be used in Square's Parasite Eve, the design for 3 of the eco-terrorists would become the basis for Final Fantasy VII protagonists Cloud, Barret, and Red 13. This attempt too fizzled out due to Square's reluctance to develop a brand new entry on aging hardware, and the uncertainty over the future of the games industry. Would 2D be seen as archaic in the steadily growing 3D space? What could the next generation of Final Fantasy look like? Was the Virtual Boy a good idea? Spoiler, no. Square decided to take matters into their own hands, hiring a handful of 3D designers and buying 4 Silicon Graphics workstations for this third and final prototype. While by today's standards, it's a little basic, only including a handful of battles, and featured the cast of FF6 as placeholders, Square were enraptured by it. So much so, they brought it to the SIGGRAPH Tech Show to show it off. After this, there was no question that Final Fantasy VII would be 3D, and their most ambitious game to date. Now they just needed a console to put it on. It might not seem like a big deal to the younger crowd for a developer to design games for a different console maker. Insomniac has flirted with Microsoft, Bungie are in bed with Sony, and even Sega, a console maker which used to do what Nintendo didn't, started making games for other systems. But Square and Nintendo were a different story. Between the Famicom and its follow-up, Squaresoft produced up to 55 games for them. Granted, back in the day, games were much quicker to turn around, but Square's direct competitor Enix only put out 39 games in that same time. There was also an unwavering loyalty Square had to Nintendo. In 1995, I was hired by the president of Squaresoft, Tetsuya Mizuno-san, and he told me that Squaresoft will always be with Nintendo. While developers like Konami and Capcom would occasionally create a game or two for the competition, Square solely made games for Nintendo and are one of the few independent developers to ever be allowed work with Nintendo IPs. Despite what adverts for the Switch may lead you to believe, Nintendo doesn't play well with others. According to a Stanford paper from 2001, the cracks in their relationship had begun to form during the SNES era. During production of Romancing Saga, Nintendo denied them access to higher capacity cartridges, forcing content to be cut. A similar issue occurred during development of Seiken Densetsu 2, which would be localized to Secret of Mana, when Nintendo suddenly decided to cancel the Super Famicom disk drive. Again, Square had to compromise the game to fit on a standard cartridge, and in 1995, Nintendo allegedly almost took Square to court after they tried to scale down production of their games, claiming they'd broken some marketing rule of Nintendo's. Between this and my preservation video, one thing about Nintendo should be clear.
He's not your fucking friend!
Admittedly, I'd take all this with a grain of salt, as I can't corroborate these claims. However, an IGN retrospective on Final Fantasy VII from 2012 notes that both Sakaguchi and Final Fantasy VII's director Yoshinori Kitase had a history of compromising their games to fit Nintendo hardware, and were getting sick of it. Square had also become concerned after rumors had circulated that the N64 specs were much lower than they hoped, so they took it upon themselves to make a few recommendations as to what they would need to make Final Fantasy happen, specifying disk-based media to keep costs down, a concern Sakaguchi had been having since the SNES era, and engineer reports from the SIGGRAPH demo that stressed significant changes to the N64 specs would need to be made to facilitate something on the scale of their game. Unfortunately, Nintendo had a prior agreement with Silicon that locked them into the final spec for the N64. Is what I'd like to say. Former Squaresoft US President Shinichiro Kajitani says all of Squaresoft's concerns and recommendations were flat out ignored by Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi. But what about other consoles? Say Sega. Sure, the Saturn could do 3D graphics, but that's like saying I could not sexualize Japanese cartoon ladies. Conceptually, we're both capable of it. Realistically, it ain't happening. So it looked like they'd again have to compromise on the quality of their game to suit Nintendo.
Remember, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.
During early pre-production, Sony approached Squaresoft with the prospect of a collaboration. Tomoyuki Takechi, Square's then CEO and president, explains of all third-party developers Sony had approached, Square was offered by far the best deal they had, including low royalty fees, money towards marketing, which they'd retain creative control over, and while PlayStation would get first crack at the next 6 titles Square produced, they reserved the rights for any additional ports, which is an insanely good deal, and they even let Square inform Nintendo of their conversations. Why were they so obsessed with Squaresoft? Sure, they lacked JRPGs in their early library, but the answer is far simpler than that. In fact, it's a tale as old as time. A classic case
of revenge.
On the 28th of May 1991 at the Chicago Consumer Electronics Show, Sony unveiled the PlayStation. Oh, not that one. The Nintendo PlayStation. Remember that cancelled Super Famicom disk drive I mentioned? That was a joint venture between Sony and Nintendo, born after Sony engineer Ken Kutaragi had developed the SPC 700 sound chip for the Super Famicom against the wishes of his superiors and almost costing him his job. However, Nintendo were taken with Kutaragi's work, and after he convinced then Sony president Norioga to explore a joint console with Nintendo, they were in business. The idea being that Sony would use their knowledge of the CD format to create an add-on for the SNES and allow for more complicated games. Sony would be allowed to create their own CD-based console, which was backwards compatible with Nintendo's already thriving SNES library, and they owned the rights to this Nintendo disc format. However, Yamauchi was immediately suspicious of Sony's intentions and felt they could become a powerful rival. So he tasked Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa to negotiate a deal with Sony's direct competitor, Philips. To rub salt in the wound, Nintendo didn't even tell Sony and publicly announced they were dropping them and partnering with the Dutch-based company a mere day after Sony's reveal. Couple that with Nintendo also tying Sony up in litigation to claim they owned the PlayStation name, and as far as they were concerned, they'd stamped out any aspirations Sony may have had for the games industry. For many at Sony this was true, but that revenge comment I made wasn't hyperbole. As GameBeat's Tristan Donovan explains, Oga was infuriated by the betrayal. Not helping things were Kutaragi egging him on to get revenge, prompting Ohega to create a new division, Sony Computer Entertainment, and placing Kutaragi in charge with the sole goal of destroying Nintendo by any means. Nothing quite like a refreshing can of corporate spite, am I right? Most people on the FF17 team would tell you the Sony deal was too good to refuse. Hiroshi Kawai suggests another reason. During pre-production, Square engineers ran parallel tests between the N64 and PlayStation to see which performed better. Based on their tests, the N64 performed 50% lower than the PlayStation, and this was before applying texture and lighting. So given that Square was very much an independent third party, PlayStation was clearly the better of the two devices, and Sony gave them a stupidly good deal, they'd be insane not to pick them, right? But Nintendo was cool with it. Wrong. They pulled a "you're not breaking up with me, I'm breaking up with you" maneuver. According to Takechi, Square had no contact at all with Nintendo for 5 years after they made the deal. Kajitani claims they were banned from Nintendo's offices for 10 years, and Kawai recalls Nintendo telling them, "If you leave, don't bother coming back." And as Russ McLaughlin writes, as far as Nintendo saw it, that betrayal made Square the enemy. Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi publicly vowed that Final Fantasy would never appear on a Nintendo console again. And according to Square Enix CEO Yoichi Wada's blog, even when they did start working together again, Nintendo management blamed everything on Squaresoft and continued to trash talk them at dinner meetings. I know it seems like I hate Nintendo, but come on man, this is the corporate version of a toddler breaking their toys for not getting what they want. No wonder Square decided to go with Sony after they sold 3 million units of PlayStation in Japan. With that done, they'd begin gearing up for production, going from their 4 Silicon workstations to 200 and starting a massive recruitment campaign for team members, increasing the FF team from 6's 30 to 40-man team to a then unheard of 150 to 200 member team. And development went pretty smoothly from there. No game's development is ever easy, and Final Fantasy VII was no exception. By the time Square finished gearing up, they had a little under a year to make the game, and also had the hurdle of this being the first time many staff had worked in 3D. This would be hard enough to deal with, but imagine if management was also a nightmare. According to a 1UP interview from 2011, as far back as Final Fantasy I, Sakaguchi was known to be difficult to work with. Part of this was due to his demanding standards, but another part was due to his, let's say, inconsistent management style. As he notes in the foreword of 500 Years Later, he'd often ask for something on a project only to see it, get mad, and just throw it out. While he was only a producer on 7, his flip-floppy style seems to have trickled down to other devs at Square. For example, Tetsuya Nomura, the game's artist and battle director, and Kingdom Hearts creator, recalls how some story beats still hadn't been finalized late into development, such as both the writer and director planning to kill every playable character but 3 during the Midgar parachute section. A decision he thankfully walked them back on. However, that wasn't the worst of it. Programmer Tatsuya Yoshinori also discusses how many Square staff, from programmers to administrative staff, worked 24-hour days to hit the game's insane deadline. There was also the unfamiliar hardware of the PlayStation that they had to come to grips with. While it was by far the most powerful console on the market, it was still a far cry from the Silicon graphics machine their original demo ran on. As CG supervisor Kazuyuki Hashimoto explains, the Silicon workstations had 256 megabytes of RAM. Aw, remember megabytes? And another 256 for texture memory. The PlayStation, on the other hand, wait, that can't be right. Holy fuck, they only had 2 megabytes of RAM on the PlayStation. To put it in numbers, that's not even 0.5% of the power of the Silicon machines. Ken Narita, the game's programmer, even vocalized to Dengeki PlayStation how the transition to Sony's system came with a ton of growing pains. It took 3 months to create a real-time rendering system for the game, there was a mandate that it had to target 60 FPS, and if the music files were too complex, it could drastically increase loading times between screen transitions. And even seemingly simple things like animating 3D characters walking on surfaces were seen as a monumental challenge. Kawai even recalls how the team got so frustrated with Sony's development tools that Square's engineers dissected the code for the PlayStation's API in order to leverage other systems to squeeze every drop of performance from the console, something Sony were very against, given that they would have to incorporate any tricks Square were using into future builds of the PlayStation. Despite all this, to read the developer's testimony, there seemed to be this unbridled passion for the game. I'm not one to condone crunch, but the devs who worked on it speak about it with an almost infectious passion, a drive to create the best experience possible that seems to have been fostered by everyone on the project. I spent most of my waking hours thinking about the game. I would get up in the morning and immediately start thinking about the game, work on the game until late at night with everyone else at Square, and go home thinking about the game, and do the same thing the next day. I didn't feel like I had to work to get things done. I wanted to do it. And it seems like Sony felt this infectious passion. Late in development, they'd approached Square with the idea of taking Final Fantasy international. While nowadays this seems like a no-brainer, at this point in the franchise's history, only 3 of the prior games had been released in America, and none had reached us here in Europe. They also spent $40 million on 7's development, making it the most expensive game ever made. To them, it seemed like an unnecessary risk. But again, Sony came out with an insane deal, offering more cash for marketing and royalty fees that, according to one Square staffer, would make their return almost as if they had published the game themselves. And they would need this money. Kyoko Higo, assistant marketing associate for Square US, notes the only way to really market the game to those unfamiliar to JRPGs was through television advertising to show it off properly. And they went in hard on the TV adverts. A reported $20 million was spent on North America advertising, another 10 for Europe, and combined with the 10 already spent in Japan, this doubled the budget of the game. Luckily, it would really pay off and instill a fever craze in the West for it. Higo remembers QA testers would mention how friends were excited for the game's release, and fan magazines at the time constantly hyped its release. Hell, if you watch the Retro Perspectives PlayStation UK magazine series, it seems like every issue prior to release gushes about Final Fantasy VII. Surely, given the unsure nature of the game standing outside of Japan, and that they had spent as much on advertising as the game itself, they'd do their best to adapt the game. Right? If you played the original release of Final Fantasy VII, you may know the infamous translation error, "This guys are sick." Now, aside from being kinda hilarious, why does this exist? In GameSpy Quarterly Issue 8, Richard Honeywood, a former localizer for Square, revealed that the entire English translation for Final Fantasy VII was done by one guy.
What?
Back in the day, localization wasn't really seen as a priority for developers, and boy howdy are Square no exception. Honeywood recounts Basket had little to no contact with the Japanese team, leading to a ton of issues, including one of the game's biggest mistranslations, Aerith's name. Aerith was supposed to be a mixture of air and earth. Perhaps a spelling more like Earth would have brought the connotation across in English? Either way, they couldn't ask and receive this kind of information in a timely fashion in order to make informed decisions. It only gets worse from there. The actual translation tools they were provided with were in Japanese, meaning spelling and grammar checks didn't apply to English text, and for specialized characters with accents, or those little hats some letters like to wear, they had to enter the corresponding characters in kanji. Alexander O. Smith, who'd go on to optimize translation tools for Square and adapt later games in the series, revealed an IT department was annexed to help the NA localization, and the team weren't even given any text files, forcing them to use a game shard to extract them from the game. Couple all of this with total lack of quality control, and the only guys who were sick were Square. For the European localization, they do a bit better, hiring SDL, a dedicated translation company, to do the French, Spanish, and German localization. That's good, having each language done by one person per language. God damn it! French translator Véronique Roget notes the script they were provided didn't even make it clear which characters were speaking or give context to what they were even talking about. As she puts it, they were translating blindly. The STL staff and Square reached such a breaking point, they decided it would be easier to just ship them to Japan and handle the EU localization there. Problem sorted. Not when you remember work culture in Japan is way different to the West, and Square were crunching hard, meaning all three translators were expected to work 12-hour days like the other staff members, but at least no one else had to suffer. Remember earlier I mentioned the Sony deal allowed Square to port FF VII to other systems? Well, the Saturn and Nintendo were non-starters for a port. PC? That could work. So Yoshihiro Maruyama, Square US VP, contacted Keith Botsky, president of Eidos, for a PC port of their game. Eidos was chosen due to Square being impressed by their earlier efforts on Tomb Raider, which had both a PS1 and PC version. But Botsky also feels that both Square and Eidos shared similar values. But as should be expected from this story, it wasn't smooth sailing for them either. In 2017, PC Gamer interviewed the team for 7's PC port. In it, engineer Jay Fong reveals the only documentation that Square provided them was the game code of an unfinished Japanese build and a few handwritten notes in Japanese. At the time, the Eidos team had a single Japanese speaker, however, they weren't a programmer, meaning they still couldn't properly relay the information to the port team. Luckily, an ex-Square staffer joined Eidos, making development easier. Easier in the way it's technically easier to empty an Olympic pool with a spoon rather than a fork. As Eidos associate producer Frank Holm explains, 80% of that code needed to be rewritten due to the base game's reliance on the PlayStation architecture and the tricks that the Square engineers had created. Also, because it wasn't a final build of the game, there were a plethora of issues that needed to be removed from the game, again, by the Eidos team. Jason Greenberg, a 3D artist, recalls having to work a full 24-hour day to remove a game-breaking bug in the final boss fight. But even with all their hard work, the final release is still a technically inferior product. Featuring a remix of Uematsu's God tier OST with worse instruments, running at a stuttery 15 FPS and continuing to do so for 2.5 decades, and as Greenberg tells PC Gamer, Square refused to provide Eidos with the original assets for the game, making it visually worse than the PS1 version. With all this in mind, Botsky projected the PC port, warts and all, would sell about 100,000 units. It sold 1 million. Wait, what? UK gaming magazine Computer and Video Games, didn't want a second pass at that name, reported that the Japanese release sold 2 million copies in its first week. Demand was so high, convenience stores like Family Mart had to sell it to meet demand, and opening hours had to shift to 7 AM to 11 PM. The magazine would also estimate they brought in £70 million in revenue that week alone. I should also mention the same magazine on the next page promises Nintendo's N64 disk drive is totally coming in Europe, which I find personally hilarious. Outside Japan, David Bamberger of Sony Computer Entertainment America had a $20 bet that the game wouldn't sell 1 million copies in its first 6 months. After 3, it had become the best-selling game of 1997, moving 3 million units in America and another 2 in Europe. Higo recalls the week of release in North America, Sony buying the US team at Square champagne, and they even presented Vice President of Marketing, Jun Iwasaki, a plaque commemorating the achievement, which moved him to tears, and that's just kinda nice, guys. The game still to this day tops sales figures in the franchise, and is considered one of the best games in the franchise and a pillar of gaming. And for good reason, because it's a perfect game with no issues. Oh man, every freaking time with this. Final Fantasy VII is one of the buggiest games I've ever played, and I ain't just talking about the Dune sandworms. Hey-oh, look out! We have fun here. Back in 2016, 4-8 Productions did an almost half-hour-long video breaking down most of them, and you should totally watch it. They range from innocent enough like this,
Every step is a new nightmare!
to oh my god, we forgot to code key features into the game. For example, in the original release, armor pieces that increase magic defense, yeah, they don't do that. The darkness debuff doesn't affect enemies, making items like ink or spells that inflict it useless, and multiple enemy scripts can be broken, leaving them either defenseless, throwing up error messages, or crashing the game. You can also skip the entire Midgar parachute section by running to the right during a cutscene. Some of these were fixed in later editions like the PS4 port, but even that brought its own issues, like music awkwardly cutting out. Were you gonna say something? Should I say something? I don't know what you want me to. Oh my god, I'm in a fight! They even kept in the save scumming exploit that lets you get a gold chocobo in Act 2, letting you get endgame rewards at the halfway point, making enemies a walk. But I'd never do that. To me, Knights of Camelot, let us slay Hojo so that we may dine in Avalon with Artoria herself!
Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die.
Now I'm fully aware that good games can be buggy. Hell, Starfield fans have built a whole religion around that fact. But unlike that game, Final Fantasy VII is actually fun. If you're a Starfield fan and that triggered you, just pretend I said Redfall. If you're a Redfall fan, get help. Here we go, Kevin's millennial bias is popping off. True, I am almost 30. And I do have a soft spot for low poly models, but in 1997, I was 3 and couldn't read. I can pretty confidently say if you get past the dated models, you are rewarded with one of the most complex and rewarding RPG combat systems I've ever played, with an emotionally complex and personal narrative and one of the most memorable casts in any game I've ever played, even with characters that for 90% of the game look like knockoff Lego figures with the emotional range of my waifu pillows. In Dengeki PlayStation Issue 40, director of the game Yoshinori Kitase noted that the previous game's goal was to have 10 main characters, whereas 7's goal was to solely focus on one character, Cloud. Every major story beat or character arc either connects or is an allusion to Cloud's journey. It really creates one of the most focused and realized video game narratives I've ever played, with themes that have become even more relevant 25 years later. Seriously, how many games make you violent eco-terrorists and actually have you face the consequences of those actions? Hell, the remake didn't even do that. Is it in Kev's top 10? No. But if we say top 20 or 15, there'd be a case to be made. And I can totally see why some people love it. I mean, for God's sakes, it's Batman's favorite video game.
Mine, I think it's a lot of people's favorite game. Final Fantasy VII was, still one of the most. Probably one of the only times I've cried in my life is when Aeris dies.
If you need more proof, according to Shuhei Yoshida, known PS Vita stan and PlayStation man, everything changed after Final Fantasy VII. The success of 7 saw a massive boom in JRPGs on the PS1, with titles like Dragon Quest, Star Ocean, Wild Arms, and even Sony's own Legend of Dragoon. And for the next 3 generations, Sony'd be the premier place for JRPGs. Square would also port all 6 prior games to PlayStation and continue to expand on the franchise with titles like Chocobo Racing and Final Fantasy Tactics, and the next 3 mainline releases would all perform ridiculously well. Look, I'd love to just end the story there. Lord knows I've been talking shite long enough. However, much like the ending of the game, the story is a little bit more bittersweet than that. After production wrapped on 7, Sakaguchi and Hashimoto created a film studio in Hawaii, beginning production on Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, which according to Steve Gray, VP of Game Production for Square USA, was, and I quote, from the beginning. A simple Google of the film will reveal middling to outright terrible critic and audience reception, and yeah, it's not great. For one thing, they cast IRL Tifa Lockhart, aka 90s Ming No Wei, as a voice actor.
We were on the verge of greatness. We were this close.
However, Gray goes on to explain Sakaguchi's loose management style and a total lack of storyboarding plagued production with delays, needless work being done, and a refusal to take advantage of tax credits provided by Hawaii caused production to balloon, and Square was just bankrolling the whole thing. When it flopped in 2001, the company was in a bad place, and it was reported to be the first time they had ever gone into the red. Takechi would step down as CEO, and Sakaguchi would follow not soon after. And yeah, he was trying to do the right thing, but many devs noted how involved Sakaguchi was with major decisions at the company, and his sudden departure led to a power vacuum in Square with no one willing to take responsibility. Sure, he may have led to their financial woes, but he also allowed them to move quickly and create amazing games. Tetsuya Nomura even likened Sakaguchi's departure to a civil war at Squaresoft. Eventually, Yoichi Wado would fill the role of CEO from 2001 to 2013, repairing Square's relationship with Super Nintendo, bringing the company out of their financial woes, and even overseeing the merger of Square and Enix. While I don't want to belittle Wada's achievements, some of his decisions would be to the detriment of their games. For one, he implemented sub-franchising of the various titles in the Final Fantasy brand, but isn't the whole point that they're supposed to be an anthology? Like, what the hell does the final part mean then? Between 2004 to 2007, at least one additional piece of media was added to Final Fantasy VII each year, including a mobile game prequel, a third-person PS2 shooter set after the original and focusing on its most boring character, a PSP game that would have been good if they didn't have a J-pop star's weird self-insert character, and a CGI movie sequel where nothing really happens and the whole thing was basically just mid-2000s YouTube AMV bait. Iwasaki feels Square wore out fan loyalty to the brand, given the inconsistent quality of their games. Another Square staffer felt their company had become far more bureaucratic in nature and focused less on the quality of a product and more on the volume. Sakaguchi also revealed in a 2014 PAX panel, this rigid structure led to a Chrono Trigger sequel being shelved, and after Square Enix acquired Eidos, who were working on Deus Ex Human Revolution, they had to fight tooth and nail all the way up to Wada to get a throwaway reference to Final Fantasy, because he didn't want to hurt the brand. Speaking of hurting the brand, there was this strange need to tie everything to Final Fantasy VII. X2, terrible name, alludes to it being set in the same universe as 7. Nomura described FF13 protag Lightning as red-headed female Cloud before release, which is wrong on 2 levels, cause A, Cloud was not as boring as Dishwater, and B, has pink hair, right? Speaking of 13, it's almost universally hated, as are all of its sequels. Even with the third one nostalgia pandering with pre-order bonuses of Cloud's gear and sword from Final Fantasy VII. No one ever talks about 11, 12 divided the fan base, 14 was so bad the only way they could fix it was by Thanosing the entire world, and 15, I was fine. Like, nothing to write home about. It's basically Stand By Me, but with like K-pop fuckboys, and that's not for everybody. Mainly just the Tumblr girlies. And this trend continued even after Wada left the company. He was replaced by Yosuke Matsuda in 2013, who was somehow even worse. Under him, the company would double down on NFTs, somehow fuck up what should have been a slam dunk in the Avengers, and killed IPs like Legacy of Kain. He's also been featured as a boss in the aforementioned Final Fantasy XV, and the Square Enix published Nier Automata, but that only happens if you demand it, which is an insane ego trip, or your employees hate you so much they want to kill you. Now, I'm not saying it's been all bad. Creators like Yoshi P and Creative Business Unit 3 turned 14 around completely, and 16 is incredible. I love that game. However, throughout my research, there's been a quote from their first CEO I haven't been able to get out of my head. If you don't take risks, the flowers won't bloom. Sure, games like Final Fantasy VII Remake do really well, and the pixel remasters are a welcome thing, but where's that mad lad mentality that brought us Kingdom Hearts or Vagrant Story? The company that created a franchise where reinvention was the only constant. Now we have a developer more interested in reminding you they used to be cool and doing gross business to exploit your loyalty. Even their creators are unsure of what the future holds for their premiere series. I'm really glad Final Fantasy VII exists, and hey, if you like the remake games, that's great. As for me, I'm kinda sad to see Square Enix start to go down the same path as Konami and throw away everything that made them, them. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to check the description for a link to Matt's book. I'm not associated with Amazon or an affiliate or anything. I just thought it was a really good book. Also, we've got a lot more of you here, probably because of the preservation video, and I really appreciate that, because that video had been dead in the water when I first released it. If you want to join those guys, don't forget to like and comment and subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay up to date when I post another video, God knows when. If you want to see something else, maybe check out this video here that I did on the slow death of Marvel. I thought it was pretty good. Or this one, about how loot boxes started out as a good idea, but then became really bad. See you in the next one, guys.